Well, and in some of course, like I've looked at a number of polls in Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio. You're 6, 5, and 4, so you're doing very well. Still in the middle of the pack. Do you see Donald Trump faltering? Do you see him waning?
I like Donald. I respect him. There have been other candidates in this race who've gone out of their way to try to smack Donald with a 2x4, and I haven't been one of them. I am glad he's in the race. And I'll note, I think the most beneficial thing Donald Trump's involvement in the race has been, I think his involvement has been tremendously helpful to my campaign because it's framed the central question of this primary as who will stand up to Washington. And if that's the central question, the natural next question that any voter will ask is, okay, well, who actually has stood up to Washington? Who has a record in that regard?
Do you believe eventually you could beat him based on your principles?
I think that's right. I think in time, I don't believe Donald is going to be the nominee, and I think in time, the lion's share of his supporters end up with us. And I think the reason is what I was just saying, that if you look to the records of all the Republican candidates, there's a big difference between my record and that of everyone else. If you ask who has stood up to Washington, who's taken on not just Democrats, but taken on leaders in their own party, Republican leadership, whether it was leading the fight to stop Obamacare, whether it was leading the fight to stop executive amnesty, or actually just going back to last week. At the last Republican debate in California, every Republican candidate stood up there and said, we need to defund Planned Parenthood. But last week, when we had an epic drag-down fight in Washington, not a one of them showed up. Millions of conservatives rose up to defund Planned Parenthood. I was proud to lead that fight. And yet, the other 10 candidates, not a one of them showed up and led. Can you imagine? I would have been glad to welcome every other Republican presidential candidate to Washington to together call in unison on John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, stop giving taxpayer funds to Planned Parenthood. And yet it seemed the other candidates were in witness protection. They were nowhere to be found when the fight was being waged. And I think that's why conservatives are unifying behind our campaign, is because they're looking for a leader who they can count on day in and day out to stand up and fight for them.